I moved to Colorado in 1970 from upstate New York. I grew up though in Wisconsin, and I was just after the Second World War is the period of time when I was just starting to really be interested in things, and I got interested in cars right at the time when cars started to be really cars, which was right after the war, and they changed them every year, and pretty soon I could name them all like some of you guys could. What I really wanted to do as a kid was have that corner gas station. You know, most every town had gas stations on at least one corner, sometimes 2, 3, and lots of them 4. And that looked like a cool job to me because the guys that had those stations were usually pretty young. They always had a hot rod of some kind. And so they spent their time working on their car, and then when somebody came in, they ran out, took them a couple of minutes, pumped gas, washed their windshield, and collected a lot of money. And that looked to me like the career. But my folks said, "No, Clyde, you really ought to try and do a little bit more than that, and give college a shot." So they sent me off to school and paid my bills. And I ended up with a degree in engineering way back in the early 60s. But I also finished, I had a wife and 2 kids by the time I got done. And took a job with Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. That's how I got there. Never lost my love for old mechanical things, and just didn't have any money to do it until about 1970 when Kodak bought the property over by Windsor, Colorado. Any of you know where the Kodak plant is over there? About 3,000 acres. I'd spent 2 years in the service in Utah, and I really liked the weather in Utah a lot better than I liked it in upstate New York. If you've been back there, you can understand why. And so I had my hand up and said, "I would love to go out and help you start up that new plant." And fortunately, I was able to do that and moved my family out here in 1970, and I've lived in Loveland for 30 years, and then I moved here to Berthoud 10 years ago. But after I got out here, I had some time. My kids were getting older, and I started getting back into doing some things with cars again, mechanical stuff. And what you see is what happens when you get out of control. Because I've been collecting this stuff, and I love to get my hands dirty. My wife says that if it's big, heavy, and dirty, Clyde, you're going to like it. She said, when you're going to get done with it, it's still going to be big, it's still going to be heavy, but it's not going to be quite as dirty as it was. Well, a little history, and this will be more interesting to you. Until the 1700s, all the way back in man's history, there were really only 4 sources of energy. Okay? And think about this. Wood, okay, water, and wind. And the last one's not quite as obvious to us, but it would have been not too long ago. That's whales. And it wasn't until the 1700s when the Industrial Revolution came along, and all these great inventors had all these mechanical devices to make things work better. And then, to fuel that Industrial Revolution, coal was discovered and used as another source of energy. But all this mechanical equipment took tons and tons of lubrication, you know, for all the joints. And that came from the whales. And the whales also, their oil was also used for lighting and cooking and heating. And within 150 years, there weren't any more whales left. That's about 1850. So in this country, at about that time, there was a lot of coal, and it was discovered that you could take coal oil and you could refine it and get a product called kerosene. And kerosene was absolutely a godsend because you could make everything out of it. You could make, and you could get that by refining coal oil. You could use it for heating and lighting and cooking, and it was better than whale oil because it didn't stink. If you ever smell whale oil, God, that's awful smelling stuff. And the light flickered real badly. Kerosene gave a nice steady light. And it was also discovered that you could refine a product called rock oil. came out of the ground, and this was really crude oil. It was found in 1862 by a guy named Drake back in Pennsylvania. You could dig a well in Pennsylvania, not very deep, pump up this rock oil and refine it and get kerosene. And kerosene was used for lubricants, obviously, perfumes, anesthetics. It could preserve wood or steel. And obviously, you could use it, you could get lubricants from it. And that worked out fine. The problem was when you refined a gallon of crude oil or a barrel of crude oil, you got 3% kerosene, which is what you wanted, and you got 40% of a product called gasoline, which at that time you didn't want. So all the gasoline, or virtually all the gasoline in the late 1800s was torched, burned. It was a waste product, and they used just the kerosene. And about the end of the century, the 19th century, a couple things happened. One was a guy named Otto, Nicholas Otto, in Germany, developed what you and I recognize as today's design for a modern engine, a four-stroke engine. And that was in 1876. 14 years later, that engine was incorporated into a buggy and called a horseless carriage, and it truly was a carriage with a motor instead of a horse out in the front of it. And that was in 1890. The first American car was built in 1893 by the Duryea brothers, and it was the first, 3 years later, they actually built 75 cars that were essentially the same. They had interchangeable parts, so one part could be used from one car and placed into another car. And by the end of the century, then, there were a few cars on the road that were burning using this product called gasoline. And there was a guy named Edison who developed the electric light bulb. And the electric light bulb was a far better option for lighting than was kerosene light. You could just turn a switch. Safer, quicker, and a lot easier. And it was very economical. So the crude oil that was being refined at the turn of the century switched from the kerosene being a product of interest to gasoline. And that's kind of where I get started is in that period of time for gasoline. The earliest gasoline or kerosene type pumps were called filling stations. Any of you old enough to remember your fathers? What did they call a gas station? Called a filling station. Sure. Yeah, you worked at a filling station. And then that little house thing there, that is what was called originally a filling station. And it was designed in 1905 by a fellow named Bowser. And it had a tank with a pump on the top of it. It was really a converted water pump that didn't spark. Gasoline's nasty stuff, right? And that was really the first dispensing equipment for cars.